Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this session hosted by the Chinese American Librarians Association of Northern California. My name is Ray Pan. I am the chapter president of this association. So CALA, as it's known, is part of the National Association of Librarians of Color, also an ALA ethnic affiliate. And we are really excited today to have our presenter, Sofia Leung, to talk about disrupting white supremacy through BIPOC solidarity. And we'll definitely get into that in just a moment. I wanted to really give you an idea more about CALA and what we are and who we are. We have regional chapters and groups throughout the country, actually around the world. We have a chapter in Canada, also very active groups from folks in China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Australia. And so we are a really global group that we support each other. You don't necessarily have to be Chinese or heritage, Chinese descent, but rather one that really supports the values of diversity, inclusion, equity, and supporting this profession. And so being the chapter president for Northern California for the past 2 somewhat odd years has been really a great experience and opportunity. We've hosted meetings, we've had a lot of programming and a lot of opportunities to share resources and information regarding the regional area. If you want more information, please feel free to check out cala/web.org. We sponsor a lot of research opportunities, grants, scholarships. So if you are interested in being a member, you have opportunities to apply for those, and also leadership programs. It's about close to 500 or 600 members. I might be a little bit off of that number, but it's a really good number, and we're always looking for new members. So of course, this is May, so it's the Asian Pacific Heritage Month. Just wanted to recognize that for the month of May. Of course, we know that it should be every month. We are celebrating, recognizing Asian Pacific American as well as other communities of color and the contributions and recognitions that we do. Obviously, it's not exclusively this month, but I just wanted to give a shout out to the APA Heritage Month. And for those who are tuning in and are curious, later this webinar will be featured in the CALA YouTube channel, so you can watch it there or share it with your colleagues. And so I know a lot of people have asked where will be archived and stored. And we have a lot of other interesting videos, performers by our CALA leaders. They're all librarians, library workers, and they've done a lot of great work over the years showcasing the hidden or not so hidden talents of CALA members. So with that, I will introduce our speaker, Sofia Leung. She is the Chinese American librarian, facilitator, and educator working towards fulfilling the promise of social justice in libraries and higher education. She was most recently the teaching and learning program manager at the MIT Libraries. She is an editor at the journal In the Library with the Lead Pipe and a facilitator for the Association of College and Research Libraries Information Literacy Immersion Program. And we're really excited to have her here because we had done a similar webinar a few months back, sponsored by the Asian Pacific American Asian Pacific American Librarians Association, APALA. And so she is generously given an opportunity for us to hear this again and give us this time. So with that, I'll pass it to Sofia.
Thanks, Ray. Also, oops, because I think my bio is a little old from that. I just wrapped up my last month with Lead Pipe, so I'm no longer an editor there. But anyway, I want to thank Ray and also the Chinese American Librarians Association, the Northern California chapter, for asking me to do this webinar. I also want to shout out Apollo for inviting me to give this webinar the first time around in February. And thanks to all of you for taking the time, although right now it feels like, what is time? And also I want to shout out some of my relatives who I told to watch this. I know my mom is watching, so that'll be fun for me. Okay, so I hope all of you and yours are safe and healthy at this moment. I'm feeling super lucky and privileged that I'm healthy right now and able to stay home, and that my family is as well. It's really wild how different things have become since the first time I gave this webinar. And I'd like to note that I wrote most of this before the COVID-19 pandemic started in this nation state known as the United States, but I don't think much of what I wrote previously has changed. In fact, I've added more information, so hopefully we have enough time to cover everything and get questions in. So if anything, we've seen that COVID-19 has only exacerbated many of the inequities already existing in society, and is disproportionately affecting Brown and Black communities. And Asians and Asian Americans are experiencing some of the racism that other Black and Brown folks experience regularly. So this topic is particularly relevant. So I hope that this webinar will be worth your while. And I usually like to start any workshop or presentation I do with a meditation, but I think that's a little weird in this format. So if you can just humor me and take 3 deep breaths on your own, and then I'll begin after that. Okay, great. You can go to the next slide. Thanks. Okay, so as we get started, I wanted to take a moment of silence for 2 people. The first is Ahmaud Arbery, a Black man who was shot and killed in cold blood by 2 racist white men who thought he looked quote unquote suspicious while he was out for an early afternoon run. Though he was killed in February, his killers were only arrested and charged with murder last week. That's 74 days after Ahmaud was murdered. I also want to mention Breonna Taylor, who was shot 8 times by the cops who were at the wrong house while the actual suspect was already in police custody, and no one has been held to account as of May 12th. So if you feel angry right now, and you should, I'd ask that you sit with that anger and discomfort and use it to fuel some change. So let's just take a second. Okay, next slide, please. And if you want to support Ahmaud's family, there's this link, which later when the slides go up, you can click all of my links. But this is just their GoFundMe. Okay, next slide, please. And now I'd like to take a moment to recognize and offer gratitude to the Indigenous people who cared for this land that I am on today. I'm on the unceded ancestral territory of the Massachusetts and Wampanoag peoples, and which is still home to many Native American people, including the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. I also want to acknowledge the free people forcibly kidnapped from Africa in order to be enslaved on these lands. And as a Chinese American settler and guest, it's important for me to acknowledge not just the history of violence, disease, and genocide that led to the colonization of this land and my eventual inhabitants of it. And I'd also want to say is like one thing I've been thinking about with regard to this is how to behave as a guest on these lands. And I'd ask you to do the same for the lands that you are a guest on and how you might behave. The United States government is continuing its legacy of forcible removal and hostile actions with a complete disregard for the sovereignty of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. On March 27th, in the middle of this ongoing epidemic, the Secretary of the Interior notified the tribe that he ordered the disestablishment of their reservation, which would take away their homelands yet again. So help me in showing solidarity to the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe by calling your senators and asking them to bring HR 375/S.2808 to the Senate floor to pass it as soon as possible. So you can check their website for more information as well. Next slide, please. So it's important to note that first I developed this webinar with APALA's membership and now CALA's in mind. And that's the main audience I have in mind. I only say that because I agreed to open the webinar up. And if you don't identify as Asian American, then some of what I'm saying is not for you, and that's okay. And that's not to say that you won't get anything out of this. A lot of this is for sure applicable to all folks. And I also want to acknowledge that I'm speaking about this topic as an East Asian American woman. And by no means do I believe I'm speaking for all Asian Americans, particularly since that identifier encompasses so many cultures, ethnicities, and identities. Next slide, please. One more disclaimer. So we're going to be dealing with some heavy topics today, like anti-Black racism, white supremacy, and how we're complicit in those systems. So some difficult feelings and discomfort might arise, And I just want you to be aware of that before we get started. If you're watching this with other people, feel free to check in with each other at difficult points in this webinar. Next slide, please. Okay, so first, I would like you to use the chat box to enter your name and say maybe a little bit about what brought you to this webinar, because I'm curious to know that. I'm really grateful that you joined me today on a topic that I think is super important, not just to our profession, but for justice efforts in the larger world. So feel free to use the chat box, just dump it in there. And as you're doing it, I'm gonna keep it moving just because I have so much content to get through and I wanna make sure we have time for everything, but I will try to skim those as I go. And thank you for sharing where you're from and who you are. Okay, next slide, please. So solidarity is something I'm learning about all the time. By no means am I an expert. I'm grateful to a participant in February who asked a question that adds some depth to this presentation, so I'm going to answer it a little bit now. It was about my personal journey to solidarity, which wasn't something I consciously thought about, but more something that I instinctively sought out. Just because there are so few Black, Indigenous, people of color in my graduate programs that most of us banded together out of necessity and shared experiences. And that's basically continued throughout my professional career as a librarian. That shared connection has stayed with me and continues to fuel my work now, and has led to finding some of my best friends and collaborators, for which I'm so grateful, and I think some of them are on this. So hi, everybody. So in addition to putting in like who you are and why you're here, it'd be great if you could also put in the chat box what you think solidarity is. I know this is going to be a lot in the chat box. And as we're going through this webinar, I'd want you to think about this question, which is, how do I show up for folks in the struggle that on the surface doesn't seem like it's about me? And we're going to return to that question throughout. Oh, this is great. I'm seeing some of the chat box. Yeah, I got your back. That's great. No equity, oops, unless equity applies to all. Solidarity is supporting and lifting up the voices of those less privileged. Great. About empathy, yes. Supporting and standing with other POC in our shared spaces as well as our individual spaces. Using your power and advantage for others, letting them lead. If they're angry, you are angry. Great, this is really great. So since this is going to be recorded, I know all of these will also be saved, I think. So we can move on to the next slide, please. So Ijima Olou writes, when we identify where our privilege intersects with somebody else's oppression, we'll find our opportunities to make real change. Before I really get into solidarity, it's necessary to understand where and why I have privilege and how that positions me socially, culturally, economically, and politically in this country. To quote the BIPOC Project, I use the term BIPOC to highlight the unique relationship to whiteness that Indigenous and Black, specifically African American people have, which shapes the experiences of and relationship to white supremacy for all people of color within a US context. And since we are specifically talking about Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or how I've heard it said is BIPOC, I'm mostly going to focus on race privilege. Thank you, Tawana. You're the best. Next slide, please. Okay, so Claire Jean Kim writes that Asian Americans have not been racialized in a vacuum, isolated from other groups. To the contrary, Asian Americans have been racialized relative to and through interaction with whites and Blacks. As such, the respective racialization trajectories of these groups are profoundly interrelated. She argues that Asian Americans have been racially triangulated with regard to Black and white people. And stereotypes like the model minority are used to demonstrate how Asian Americans are better than Black people, but at the same time view us as foreign outsiders who can never be American and who threaten the very Americanness of this country. This racialized positioning also determines what opportunities or limitations Asian Americans receive. So for example, colleagues never comment on how my hair or my appearance is unprofessional, or nor do they try to touch my hair. I can drive my car or be in my home or go to the library without being racially profiled by the police or so-called security. And I was able to get a home loan without any trouble. And that's not to say I don't face racism at all, but that I experience it in a very different way from other BIPOC. I also don't want to diminish the struggles that my family and many other Asian immigrant families have undergone and are still undergoing to come to the US, and the ways in which they have had to give up their own language and culture in order to be accepted, to survive, or even thrive here. Jessica Chung writes that years of colonialism, systemic biases that favor whiteness, and colorism in many Asian countries have all contributed to a belief that in order to succeed, you must either be white or assimilate into whiteness. So for many Asian Americans, to be successful is to get closer to whiteness. Next slide, please. Whiteness has historically been transferred to different ethnic groups, expanding who is considered white, like the Irish, Italians, or Jews. This has happened so often that sociologists have a term for it, whitening. Ethnic groups have seen the benefits of aligning themselves with whiteness, and Asian Americans are no different. But it's important to recognize that this is a trick, and it's a way for those in power to remain in power. And it's a way for white supremacy to control us and use us as a tool to show that, look, the system isn't rigged against non-white people because Asian Americans are able to succeed. So Asian Americans, and usually that ends up being East Asian Americans, because we have all been conflated into one monolithic group that erases the needs and concerns of other Asian Americans, whether they be Vietnamese, Cambodian, Malaysian, etc., are allowed certain privileges that make us think that if we continue to play by the rules, we'll be allowed into whiteness, and that we too can have white privilege. And it's important to note that many of us do want whiteness and its attendant benefits, whether we recognize it or not. So this tension creates a dislike or distaste among the different racial groups and gives white supremacy a hold on us. But by offering and dehumanizing us, as in Kim's words, permanently foreign, we will never be able to achieve whiteness. It's just another method to control us and use us to dominate Black folks. And that's the racial triangulation that Kim talks about. Next slide, please. So what is white supremacy? I've been using that term a lot. You can go to the next slide. I mentioned it earlier and I want to return to it so I can share these definitions of what I mean. So this first one, by white supremacy, I do not mean to allude only to the self-conscious racism of white supremacist hate groups. I refer instead to a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources. Conscious and unconscious ideas of white supremacy, white superiority, and entitlement are widespread, and relations of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutions and social settings. So it's a system of control within which we all live and have been indoctrinated into, and it uses the social construction of whiteness and racism as its main tools of domination. It is all those years of slavery, Jim Crow, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Immigration Act of 1924, the war against drugs, redlining, and the list goes on, all the way up until the horrible racist things that the federal government is enacting on brown immigrants today. Next slide, please. So some of you might be familiar with Cheryl Harris's powerful essay, Whiteness as Property, where she details how whiteness was constructed in order to justify subjugating Black and Indigenous people and then used to retain and secure power for white people. Harris's concept of whiteness as property is based on two ideas as delineated by Dumas and Ross. The first is that Black people are a form of property that white people are entitled to. The second is that all land belongs to white people, and Indigenous peoples are not entitled to property or even to be on property. And in fact, the genocide and erasure of American Indians was deemed necessary to make room for this new country of white people. And as I've mentioned earlier, it's still happening today to the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, among others. Next slide, please. So this is another definition I find helpful in understanding what white supremacy means. It is premised on the subjugation of people who are not white. That subjugation takes on an infinite number of forms and is enforced with varying degrees of physical violence, mental abuse, and robbery. White supremacy establishes, upholds, and normalizes hierarchy on the premise that the less Black you are, the closer you are to God. For me, it's important to understand these concepts because it helps to explain how and why our country was founded and the underlying beliefs that have resulted in the way things are the way they are. And it helps me to understand the racism that I experience and that other BIPOC experience. Next slide, please. So this, let me just read this quote. There's no hierarchy of oppressions where race is concerned, but anti-Black racism is the fulcrum of white supremacy. I'm gonna say it one more time. There's no hierarchy of oppressions where race is concerned, but anti-Black racism is the fulcrum of white supremacy. Let's break that down a little more because when I first read it, it blew my mind. A fulcrum gives you the leverage needed for action. As Nakagawa points out, slavery is the historical basis of our economy. He's saying the roots of our economic structures are in slavery, and I would add that the erasure of Native lives and history allowed for those roots to grow. He notes that our country's governing structures were built to accommodate slavery, that our concept of ownership rights, the structure of our federal election systems, the amount of money in politics, our legal systems, federal penitentiaries, and information institutions are all fueled by anti-Black racism. I want you to take a moment now to sit with that because it's really heavy, particularly now that in these COVID-19 times. For example, African Americans represent almost a third of US deaths from the pandemic and 30% of COVID-19 cases, despite being only 13% of the population. So by buying into this idea that the whiter we act or the more we follow the rules of white supremacy, the more we police other BIPOC, the more we try to raise ourselves up as examples of how we, as Asian Americans, were able to succeed, the more complicit we are in white supremacy and systemic racism. We become complicit in anti-Black racism. And I get it. I played by the rules for a long time, not realizing that there are other ways of doing things. And I didn't want to rock the boat. I didn't actively participate in anti-Black racism, but I also wasn't actively resisting it. I had a lot of unlearning and re-educating to do. It's an ongoing process to dismantle white supremacy in my mind in order to do it out in the world. Some of the chains I had to throw off were cultural norms that white supremacy culture taught me were how I had to behave. There's a whole list of white supremacy culture characteristics that were developed by Kenneth Jones and Tema Okun, but I just want to share a few that I personally have and continue to unlearn, or that I've noticed in LIS settings, LIS being Library and Information Studies, for those of you who aren't in libraries. Next slide, please. So these are the white supremacy culture characteristics that I picked out of the list, and I'll go over each of these in more detail. But as I, thanks again, Tawana. Great librarian. As I'm doing so, I'd like you to answer the following questions in the chat box. Yeah, and everything that I'm talking about is going to be linked in my references, but also Tawana's sharing them now, so it's great. Next slide, please. So this is the question I just want you to think about, and as I'm talking about the characteristics, I'd like you to use the chat box to enter your responses as to how you see these characteristics playing out in your daily work or life. And think about how the characteristics are in relation to solidarity and how by understanding them better, we can use them to prevent anti-Blackness. And like really think through like, why do we do things this way? Why is LIS work this way? Why do we have to do things this way, basically? Next slide, please. So the first one I want to talk about is perfectionism, right? Is like there's little appreciation expressed among people for the work that others are doing, appreciation that is expressed usually directed to those who get most of the credit anyway. It's more common to point out how the person or work is inadequate, or even more common to talk to others about the inadequacies of a person or their work without ever talking directly to them. I'm just going to take a sip of water. Mistakes are seen as personal. For example, they reflect badly on the person making them as opposed to being seen for what they are, which is just mistakes. Making a mistake is confused with being a mistake, so doing wrong is equated with being wrong. Little time, energy, or money is put into reflection or identifying lessons learned that can improve practice. In other words, little or no learning from mistakes. And there's a tendency to identify what's wrong, a little ability to identify, name, and appreciate what's right. So I think we can see that in LIS culture popping up all over the place. I'll let you put in the chat box, like maybe if you have some examples. Let's see. Someone said equity and racial justice is never a priority because the focus in libraries is too much about our everyday work, busy work, and being productive is like another side of perfectionism. Thanks, Isabel. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just reading the chat. Right, like there's a lot of, another example of just like talking around people. So it used to happen to me too. Instead of people coming directly to me to tell me like, hey, I just like want to talk about an issue I had with you, they would then, you know, talk to my boss, and then my boss would come talk to me. It's like, why don't you just own up to it and talk to me if you have a problem with me, right? Don't go running to your mom. Next slide, please. So these are some of the anecdotes to perfectionism, which is developing a culture of appreciation, just, you know, saying thank you for doing things to different people you might not normally do so to, showing gratitude, developing a learning organization where it's expected that people will make mistakes and that those mistakes offer opportunities for learning, right? Like creating an environment where mistakes are opportunities for growth. And then being able to separate the person from the mistake, and speaking positively before offering criticism, which is definitely something I have an issue with personally, and asking others for specific suggestions on how to offer that criticism. So if, you know, you can talk to someone and say like, I want to know how you want to receive feedback from me. I mean, maybe don't call it criticism necessarily. And these are just like a few of the ways. I'm sure there are plenty other ways that you can do this. Next slide, please. The next characteristic I wanted to mention is defensiveness. So in this one, the organizational structure is set up and much energy is spent trying to prevent abuse and protect power as it exists, rather than to facilitate the best out of each person or to clarify who has power and how they are expected to use it. Because of either or thinking, which we'll get to, the criticism of those with power is viewed as threatening and inappropriate or rude. I've definitely experienced that. People respond to new or challenging ideas with defensiveness, making it very difficult to raise these ideas. A lot of energy in the organization is spent trying to make sure that people's feelings aren't getting hurt or working around defensive people. Now, I have definitely experienced that in LIS. A lot of this like politeness, like, well, I don't want to hurt their feelings. Like, really, that's not a big deal. My feelings are hurt all the time and no one seemed to care. The defensiveness of people in power creates an oppressive culture. Now, I know many of us have experienced that. But, you know, feel free to put examples of that about how you'd like to share these examples. Although, yes, I did see a question about, yes, so since this is being recorded, you may not want to put like very specific details in. And yes, for sure, there's like this idea of civility. I hate it when people use that word of, oh, well, you can just be civil in this conversation, which we're going to get to another characteristic that will flesh this out a little more. But let's get to the anecdotes. So next slide, please. So we need to get the organization to understand that the structure cannot in and of itself facilitate or prevent abuse. Understanding the link between defensiveness and fear of losing power or losing face, losing comfort, losing privilege, and work on your own defensiveness. Naming defensiveness as a problem when it is one, that yes, for sure. Giving people credit for being able to handle more than you think. Yeah, I did feel like there was sometimes this idea that people would think other people were a little bit like children and you couldn't just like speak to them as like a fellow adult. Discuss the ways in which defensiveness or resistance to new ideas gets in the way of the mission. Yes, exactly, Kat. Like working with a toddler. Okay, next slide. Now we'll get to either or thinking. So things are either or, good or bad, right or wrong. You're either with us or against us. This one's closely linked to perfectionism and making it difficult to learn from mistakes or accommodate conflict. And there's no sense that things can be both and, like no room for nuance. It results in trying to simplify complex things. For example, believing that poverty is simply a result of lack of education. It creates conflict and increases sense of urgency as people are felt like, oh, I have to make a decision whether I can do it this way or that, and there's no time to or encouragement to consider alternatives, particularly those which may require more time or resources. Next slide, please. Yes, so anecdotes. Noticing when people use either or language and push them to come up with more than two alternatives. Notice when people are simplifying complex issues, particularly when the stakes seem high or an urgent decision needs to be made. Yes, that happens all the time. Slow it down and encourage people to do a deeper analysis. When people are faced with an urgent decision, take a break and give people some breathing room to think creatively. Yeah, I like to do that with like a short meditation, usually like 3 minutes, especially if things seem to be getting tense. Avoid making decisions under extreme pressure. Yes, sorry, I'm just reading the chat and seeing Cecily said, I think asking people to lean into their discomfort needs to be explained in some cases. People don't seem to or want to understand what it means to question your biases and work towards dismantling them. Yes, for sure. And I will maybe talk about what it means to me really quickly of leaning into your discomfort. So usually if I feel uncomfortable, well, that's, I think, the first way to note in yourself, like when you feel uncomfortable, what is it? Are you getting warm in your face? Your heart rate is probably getting faster. Maybe your hands start sweating, all these things. And then you start to get defensive. Maybe you attack someone with your words. I mean, for saying something that you heard differently because all of your like hackles are raised. And you got to wonder, like, when I feel that, I have to like take a step back and ask myself, like, why am I feeling this way? Do I have, well, of course I have a right to feel that way, but what particularly set me off? And then like just questioning that over and over and letting it sit, like let those feelings sit with you. You don't have to lash out at someone else because you feel those feelings. You can take a little space for yourself and think it through as to why you're feeling uncomfortable. Okay. Next slide, please. So again, I just want to reiterate the initial question I asked, which is how do you see these characteristics playing out in your daily work or life? And then next slide. So the fear of open conflict. People in power are scared of conflict and try to ignore it or run from it. And that's when I say people in power, I don't just mean like those higher up in an organization, but even whatever the power dynamic is between you and another person, it always exists, whether it's a racial dynamic, a gender dynamic, class, your position in the organization, etc. So it could be like any of those things. And if you are the person in power, you might be scared of conflict with someone who you perceive as, even whether it's unconscious or not, that they are trying to like start a fight with you or something. And so when someone raises an issue that causes discomfort, the response is to blame the person for raising the issue rather than to look at the issue, which is actually causing the problem. Back to this emphasis on being polite, equating the raising of difficult issues with being impolite, rude, or out of line. Yes, 100%. Oh no, we're talking about leaning into their discomfort still. Okay, let me just see. Cecily says, I think the consequences of asking BIPOC to lean into their discomfort becomes complicated because the physical responses we experience when faced with fragility are often our body's way of telling us to run away. Are we asking more demanding from BIPOC when we ask them to sit with their discomfort, particularly when every interaction with a white person might possibly result in that discomfort? Yeah, definitely. I don't know if I probably missed the other part of the conversation. When I ask people to sit with their discomfort, it's usually I'm asking the person with privilege to do that, right? Because you have had the privilege to not have that discomfort in the past. And now because you have one experience of feeling uncomfortable, or maybe it's getting to be more and more, you really got to ask yourself, why do I feel this discomfort that I haven't experienced before? Whereas those of us who are in white dominated culture feel this discomfort all the time, right? It's something like we live with all the time. And so we're used to dealing with it. So now it's your time as a white person to lean into your discomfort. Okay, next slide, anecdotes to the fear of open conflict. So role play ways to handle conflict before conflict happens. Distinguish between being polite and raising hard issues. Don't require those who raise hard issues to raise them in acceptable ways, especially if you are using the ways in which issues are raised as an excuse not to address the issues being raised. Yeah, I mean, that's like the best way a white person has derailed the conversation, is to be like, well, I don't know, I don't like the way you're talking to me right now, so I can't hear what you're saying. Once a conflict is resolved, take the opportunity to revisit it and see how it might have been handled differently. Oh yes, next slide. Okay, no, that's fine. We can, well, actually back to objectivity. The other way.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Is this the right slide?
Could you go back? I think it's like 2 or 3. It just says objectivity at the top. The one more to the left.
Okay.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, so the belief that there is such a thing as being objective, which is pretty hilarious if you still think this in this day and age. The belief that emotions are inherently destructive, irrational, and should not play a role in decision-making or group process, which has often resulted in people ignoring emotions, and it's gone very poorly because emotions definitely play a role, whether or not you want them to. Invalidating people who show emotion, requiring people to think in a linear fashion and ignoring or invalidating those who think in other ways, impatient with any thinking that does not appear logical to those with power. Sorry, I'm going to try to speed through this a little more since we're running low on time. Anecdotes, sorry, next slide, please. The anecdotes, recognizing that everyone has a worldview and that everyone's worldview affects the way they understand things, and that means you. Pushing yourself to sit with discomfort when people are expressing themselves in ways which are not familiar to you, and assuming that everyone has a valid point and that your job is to understand what that point is. Yeah, that last one is a little bit of what I was talking about, of leaning into your discomfort. Next slide, please. So the right to comfort. This is the belief that those with power have a right to emotional and psychological comfort, scapegoating those who cause discomfort, equating individual acts of unfairness against white people with systemic racism, which daily targets people of color. Next slide. The anecdote to that is understanding that discomfort is at the root of all growth and learning. So that returns back to what we were talking about before, and welcoming it as much as you can, deepening your political analysis of racism and oppression so you have a strong understanding of how your personal experience and feelings fit into the larger picture. And not taking everything personally, which to me is speaking directly to like white fragility, which we can also have as Asian Americans, for sure, like feeling some defensiveness when you hear certain things of like, I think it goes back to that ranking of oppressions where you feel like, well, I also have felt oppression. So, you know, that means that what we shouldn't also show empathy and care for folks who are feeling oppressed more on a daily basis. I don't think that's true. Next slide, please. Okay. So I used to not understand why some Asian Americans wanted to rank our oppression against the oppression that other BIPOC experience, particularly that of Black people. But now I understand that it's about power and control. And white supremacy seeks to divide us and make us think that there is a limited amount of respect, recognition, power, and wealth that we are all in competition for. And this isn't true. We don't have to be in competition for any of that. I don't know about you, but I don't want to be used as a tool for white supremacy. And I don't think that you do either. We need to refuse the ways in which white supremacy seeks to manipulate our thoughts, beliefs, and behavior. Knowing how we are complicit in perpetuating white supremacy and anti-Black racism helps us to figure out how to stop it and where we can do things differently. Next slide, please. Jessica Chung wrote an article about how we can stop contributing to anti-Blackness that I'm borrowing from here. So first, we need to stop perpetuating that white equals the ideal. We need to ask ourselves whether what we value is actually what we value or whether it's been told to us by white supremacy culture. Recognize and reject negative portrayals of Black people. The media is another tool that those in power use to keep us all down. By believing in the stereotypes that the media show about Black people, Asian Americans can pat themselves on the back by how not Black we are, and we can happily buy into white supremacy. But we have to wake up to the ways that media manipulates and tells us what to think. This is particularly important when we think about our roles as librarians and library workers. What are we allowing into our collections, and who or what is seen as authoritative? For our programming, is Black History Month the only time that we're showing positive portrayals of Black people? How are Black colleagues in the libraries being treated? And how are Black folks being treated in libraries and archives, period? Educating ourselves and our families. Educating ourselves also means unlearning what we were taught through white supremacy. That means we need to learn more about Black history, read Black stories written by Black people, not by white people. We are accountable for our communities. We can't just stop with educating ourselves. In 2016, after the police shooting of Philando Castile, Christina Shu mobilized hundreds of young Asian Americans online to collectively write an open letter to their parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles, asking them to support movements like Black Lives Matter. The letter was then translated into numerous languages to be shared with Asian American families. And I've included a link to this letter in my references, which is now part of a bigger movement, and also a Code Switch podcast episode about it, where they talk to Christina Shu and also listen in on a conversation with one woman and her father after he reads the letter. So finally, understanding that the fight for social justice for Black Americans is directly tied to our own struggles for justice. And now understanding how anti-Black racism is the fulcrum through which white supremacy operates, we can understand how all of our racial oppressions are tied to one another, and they're all about the same thing: power over other groups of people. Next slide, please. Our liberation is interlocked with the liberation of other people, and we won't truly be free if other people are being oppressed in order for us to have freedom. So this isn't to say that our individual experiences of racism should be ignored or that homogeneous racial groups shouldn't be able to gather separately. This is more about what we can do when we build it together. Next slide. So now, after all of that information, which I know was a lot, I want to ask you again, what is solidarity? Next slide. Merriam-Webster gives this definition of solidarity: unity as of a group or class that produces or is based on community of interests, objectives, and standards. So that sounds nice, but I don't like the way that it says unity that produces or is based on. Solidarity to me is something active and built by community. So in practice, to me, it means to show up for one another and support another group's fight. David Stovall has a great way of explaining this at a panel he was on at Google in 2016, and the clip is about a minute long, so if you just bear with me because it's worth listening to. Next slide with the link.
Can you see my screen, Sophia?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This is the link, right?
Yes.
Be clear that I recognize that I'm not okay with the fact that from a parity perspective, I'm calling and saying what we need to do as people, and I'm calling upon other people, but on the same token, not acknowledging my own conversation.
Oh, wait, I think this it's a little before this. Oh, that's weird. How come the link, it should have opened right on the,
Let me,
can you go back more?
how about here?
Hold on, sorry, everybody. Let me just check my notes as to where it was supposed to be.
I can click it again too. Let me do that.
Questions. So is Anna Turner, how can corporations best participate
Yes,
in racial justice without undermining existing social movements? Who wants that?
There's a great science educator by the name of Yomo Mutegi, who's at the University of Indiana, Indianapolis.
You're going to spell that one later.
Yeah. And Yomo always makes this point. He says, here's what you can do. He says, first, you can apologize. Second, do not start to join or make claims about a commitment to anything that you are not willing to support. Third, get out of the way, right? So it's always these things around, because a lot of times, and this is a thing in education, we often talk about this, the word help is temporary, right? We're talking about solidarity, which is a very different thing. It is a more contested word. It means something different. It means that you have agreed to support something that will challenge you in the support of it. So now that I think that becomes important, because I hate it when I hear folks say, I just want to help. We don't need that, right? I want to be clear about that, because all that is temporary, and all that is a feel-good thing. What we want folks to do is to be able to challenge their existence in this. We got to ask a different set of questions, because I might even depart in a different space, because when we look at the language of this country, we see something different. Not just in the Emancipation Proclamation, not just in the Constitution.
Thanks.
We need to.
So what Stovall says is super powerful, that you have agreed to support something that will challenge you in the support of it. And at some point, you have to get out of the way of the people committed to doing that work. You have to ask yourself, is what I'm doing helpful, or is it actually harming the very folks I'm trying to support? Layla Saeed puts it another way on the Citizen Well podcast. If you are doing this work and you are still comfortable, then not much has changed, while intellectually you may understand what's going on. So let's return to my earlier question of how do I show up for folks in the struggle that on the surface doesn't seem like it's about me. Next slide, please. The BIPOC project has a set of solidarity principles that I find useful to guide any action taken in solidarity. I don't think we have time right now to go over it, so I'll just ask you to look at it on your own later. I included a link to it in my references, or you can look at my slides later. Next slide, please. So, what are some of the challenges or opportunities you've encountered when trying to be in solidarity with others? You can use the chat box. And as you're doing that, can you go to the next slide, please, Ray? So what we need to be doing, as Jorge Lopez McKnight has said, we need to be remaking our experiences with each other, the profession, and the world we want to see. We can do that if we organize and get in solidarity through being in community with one another. We can strengthen and transform society. As Adrienne Marie Brown says, every member of the community holds pieces of the solution, even if we are all engaged in different layers of the work. Next slide is another clip. This is from Tiffany D. Lofton on the Brown Girls Guide to Politics podcast.
I'm not saying, well, we need to solve mass incarceration because mass incarceration is a problem. I'm saying, what does it look like to have a world with no prisons? What does it look like to have a world where free Wi-Fi is everywhere? What does it look like to have a world where education is free? Not just let's solve student debt, but like, what about free education? And if we don't have an abundance agenda, if we don't think about freedom as a proactive frame of reference, then we're going to continue to burn ourselves out with what we know we need to fight against, and not what we need to fight for.
So I really liked that quote, obviously. And another participant from the last webinar asked this important question of what are we giving up to be in solidarity? So I'm going to try to repeat what I told them, which is to think about reframing this question with Tiffany Lofton's words in mind of what do we gain by being in solidarity? I don't think we give up anything to be in solidarity with one another, except maybe our pride. But the rewards that we gain by being in solidarity with one another are abundant. The work is tiring, and we really need to be in community with one another in this fight. Next slide, please. So what can happen when we open up to other communities of color and do this work in relation to one another? I added this extra slide of what we could do to act in solidarity during this weird time where we're all quarantined. And I also know that there are many non-Asian and Asian Americans listening to this, so I've included some ways that you can be allies and accomplices to us as well. So first is, of course, reading about what's happening to Black, Native, and other communities of color. For example, I heard today on NPR's Code Switch podcast, which I've linked to it in that first bullet, is that the Navajo Nation is third in terms of infection rate of COVID-19 cases after New York and New Jersey, which is insane. The Navajo Nation now has more coronavirus cases per capita than any other state in the US. So thinking about like, where are you getting your news? If you listen to that episode of Code Switch, they provide a bunch of places where you can get your news about Native Americans in your local area. And educating yourself and your family by going to those news sources. I also want to shout out Dr. Sarah Park-Dallin, who created a list of COVID-19 anti-Asian racism resources for K through 12. I've also linked that there, and thanks to her for that work. And then keeping an eye out for anti-Asian or anti-Black or anti-BIPOC sentiment or action, and be ready to capture it on camera. On that same Code Switch podcast, I think it was Jeff Chang, mentioned like that someone spit on him when he was waiting in line at the supermarket. And so like one of the things you can do is try to capture it on camera, because as we know, that is the only way that Ahmaud Arbery found justice, or not even, well, I mean, is it even justice yet? The first step towards justice. So, you know, just be ready to capture it on camera, or at least like say something when it happens if you are in a privileged position. And speaking out on those issues, as I mentioned, when you see the opportunities to do so. There's also this Medium post by an Asian American about 20 or so allyship actions for Asians to show up for the Black community right now. And some of these are actions that anyone can take. And there are many places that you can donate. I've included a link to the official Navajo Nation's COVID-19 Relief Fund. So in closing, I just want to push you all to think about your next moves towards solidarity with BIPOC in your particular location, whether it's to examine current efforts ongoing by other people and supporting those movements. And then next slide, please. And I want to leave you with this Miriam Kaba quote that I find really powerful. Nothing that we do is worthwhile. Wait, did I say that right? Nothing that we do that is worthwhile is done alone. Next slide. So thank you to Jorge Lopez McKnight for his insights, thoughtfulness, and pushing me to be better, and for sending me some resources for this topic, especially since I'm no longer at an academic institution, so I've had to rely on him and others to get my scholarly articles. And thank you again to Ray and CALA and CA for giving me an opportunity to give this webinar a second time. There's 3 slides after this of just like all references, so you can take a look at those in your spare time. And then I'll take questions, I guess, in the last 3 minutes. Sorry, I know I had to speed through the end. There was just too much stuff to tell you all about.
Great, thanks, Sophia. And thank you so much for your work on this and for sharing your thoughts, and everyone here for being active and participating in the chat. If you have any questions, please feel free to type. Happy to try to answer them in the time we have left. And you are also able to message me directly if you want to ask the question privately. Thanks.
Oh, thank you, everybody. These are really great comments in the chat, but also feel free to ask me questions. Or you can follow up with me. Some people I tried to follow up with on Twitter after the first webinar. Ozzy, I think that's how you pronounce her name, said, people are often very quick to share images of Black death, but I don't typically see non-Black people ever intentionally spreading depictions of Black joy, which creates this narrative of Black life being rooted in suffering, and they feel that daily. Yes, thank you for sharing that. Something definitely I'll keep in mind myself. Oh, my social media handles are on this slide, at Sofia Leung on Twitter. My Instagram's on a more personal side, so I probably won't share that because it has nothing to do with my work.
Yeah, here's a question here. When you speak to groups about this topic, especially Asian American, are they open to receiving this information?
Yeah, great question. I actually haven't spoken on this topic before the first webinar I gave in February. It's more about like something that I think about doing in my everyday life, whether I have to like respond to posts on Facebook or having individual conversations with friends and family. I think that's the work that I've seen this for myself. But yeah, for sure, this presentation I would love to do elsewhere and give to other Asian Americans, talk about other folks too. I think that the defensiveness pops up in any group of people that I talk to, and it's not just Asian Americans.
Great. Well, we are on the top of the hour. It's 12 p.m. Pacific here, and I know many of you might have to get back to other things, and we want to respect that and give you the time, as well as respecting Sophia's time. Please join me in thanking Sofia Leung again for this really important and timely presentation. We'll send the recording out via YouTube channel through CALA, and I hope everyone enjoy the rest of their day. And thank you so much for attending and being active.
Yes, thank you. The chat was very active.